Paul McCulley will introduce his friend Bill Miller. Bill will speak. We will do the Q&A session informally over lunch. Bill has the difficult task of being between us and lunch, but he's up for it. So without further ado, Paul, will you introduce our keynote?
Good afternoon again. As chairman of the Society of Fellows, I had the privilege of asking a friend to give our keynote today. Bill Miller's bio is in your materials. His 30 years at the top of the game speaks for itself. An incredibly thoughtful man, and he and I have solved the problems of the world many, many times. If only we could have someone listen to us, we wouldn't have to keep doing it. But I think that Bill and I will be solving the problems of the world for the rest of our adult lifetime, and both of us are kind of adults. My friend Bill Miller.
Well, thanks very much, Paul, David, GIC, for inviting me here. Make a disclaimer up front, which is that I'm not a central banker. I'm not an academic. I'm not a Fed watcher the way Paul was. I'm not even a bond person who has to deal with this stuff day to day. I'm an equity person for 30 plus years. And so my remarks, as will be evident in a few minutes, come with them trailing clouds of economic ignorance. So I hope you'll indulge me a little bit of that. But nonetheless, I do have the task of navigating in capital markets and on behalf of individuals, institutions, sovereign wealth funds. And so my remarks here are more in the way of impressions. And the topic is time travel in the Minsky moment. I'd say I'll retitle a little bit, which we can say a plea for pragmatic policy could be a different way to think about this. And I'll start this off by a cartoon which certainly illustrates many things in my career. A little kid playing with a balloon here, and then it splashes in his face, and he says, "How can something seem so plausible at the time and so idiotic in retrospect?" When I look at what's going on, I'm going to give you a few stories which will illustrate the thrust of my remarks. In just about 30 years ago, I went down to the Fed. This is 1982, December of 1982. The stock market bottomed in August of 1982. The economic news is very bad, and I sat down with then Preston Martin, the vice chairman of the Fed. And I said to him, "Governor Martin, do you think that the economy is in recovery? We had a terrible recession, and we'd had actually Mexico default in its debt." And he said, "What do you think?" And I said, "Well, with all due respect, I didn't come down here to figure out what I thought. I didn't need to drive down to do that. I came to see what you thought and the other members of the Fed." And he said, "Well, it's much more important to know what you think than what I think." And I said, "Well, how can that be, given that you and your fellow governors actually can have an impact? In fact, your job is to have an impact on the economy, and I can have no impact at all." He said, "Well, the reason is," he said that your job depends on your getting this roughly right. He said, "We can't get fired." He said, "You have a much greater incentive to get this right than we do." He said, "So it's important what you and people like you in the markets think." And then he paused and said, "There's a change in Fed policy underway." And he said, "It's becoming more market-based and less theory-based." And he said, "It's a change at the margin, like all economics is." He said, "But I think it's an important one." So that's story number one. Story number two, I was just in all these stories. I was at a conference on the economy, and Douglas North, who won the Nobel Prize in economics, was giving a talk on why some nations are economically successful and why other ones are not economically successful. And he said to the audience, "Why do you think that Venezuela is such a basket case?" And he says, "I can tell you that it's not because they don't get first-rate economic advice." He said, "Because I am the principal economic advisor to the government of Venezuela." And he said, so the president says to me, "Well, the economy's doing terribly. We need to do something." And he said, "Why don't you deregulate your gas prices because gasoline is 20 cents a liter?" And he said, "Well, we can't do that because there'll be riots in the streets if people are used to that." So, okay, well, then you need to change the structure of your labor markets. You have a lot of labor rigidity, and so to open that up, he said, we can't do that. Unions, we have a general strike, we'd lose our elections. And the point being that all of these economic questions were not economic questions so much as social questions and political questions, which I think is what's going on today. And lastly, and this is more recently, I was in Brunei, and I was in a meeting with the oil minister. In Brunei, if you've ever been there, it's about as hot as any place on Earth, in conjunction with about the highest humidity of any place on Earth. And in the oil minister's office, it was fiery hot. There was no air conditioning, unlike in the finance minister's office. And so I finally, sweat's pouring down. Finally, I said, Mr. Minister, is the air conditioning broken in here? And he said, no. And I said, well, it doesn't appear to be working well. He said, no, it's turned off. And I said, why is the air conditioning turned off? And he said, we're trying to set an example of saving energy. And I said, but you sit atop this giant oil, it's an entire oil economy. And he says, yes, but we want people to conserve energy. And I said, well, you know, the gas stations out there, there's no price posted. The only two reasons that can be, number one would be that the price is fixed, or number two, that it's a monopoly and so nobody can compete on price. He said, no, the price is fixed. I said, how much is that? He's about the same as Venezuela, like 20 cents a liter. I said, well, why don't you conserve energy by raising the price of gasoline? He said, oh, the people would hate that if we did that. And I said, this isn't a democracy. Why do you care if the people hate it or not? And he said, well, the Sultan wants the people to be happy, so we want it. So again, it's a social issue, I think, in a lot of these things. So this is a quote from Lenin. There are decades when nothing happens, and there are weeks when decades happen. I think the Minsky moment that Paul talked about the crisis in 2008, those were weeks where decades happened. And just a clarification of terminology, risk versus uncertainty. When we talk about managing risk, I think we're talking really about managing uncertainty. Risk is what insurance companies do. You know, they want to know what it costs to insure somebody against a car accident or something like that. But uncertainty, and that's where we don't know the probability distribution, or in the Keynesian sense, we don't even know what the outcomes are. That's what the markets are reacting to. The so-called risk on, risk off is not risk on, risk off. It's uncertainty on or uncertainty off. So when you have something like the LTRO, it reduces uncertainty, markets react positively. Okay, so this financial crisis are not new, and I think Rogoff and Reinhardt went back 800 years. The first real financial crisis, 33 AD, under Tiberius. Here's something from Tacitus' Annals. The destruction of private wealth precipitated the fall of rank and reputation, till at last the emperor interposed his aid by distributing throughout the banks 100 million sesterces and allowing freedom to borrow without interest for 3 years, provided the borrower gave security to the state and land to double the amount. Credit was thus restored, and gradually private lenders were found. I find it just an unusual coincidence that the LTRO is 3 years and the first lending under Tiberius was 3 years. Both in Italy. How about that? So this is a quote from Keynes, a great piece, The Great Slump of 1930. He said, we have involved ourselves in a colossal muddle, having blundered in the control of a delicate machine, the workings of which we do not understand. And I think that's the case today. If we understood the workings of the machine in detail, we would not be in the muddle that we're currently in with respect to both financial crisis and what's going on in Europe today. So I think being humble in the face of ignorance here is probably pretty good advice. Irving Fisher, the great economist, had a go at trying to figure out how these problems happen. This is one of his things from a piece in Econometrica in 1933. I would just direct your attention to two things. Number one, the first part of what kicks off these problems, which is, he calls it a mild gloom and a shock to confidence. So nothing really terribly dramatic, but just a change in the course of things, and then it reverberates through the system down to number before number 9, after number 10, protection, banks selling investments, bank failures, and that's kind of where we got to ultimately in this process. So here's Fisher's conclusion. Then we have the great paradox, which I submit is the chief secret of most, if not all, Great Depressions. The more the debtors pay, the more they owe, the more the economic boat tips, the more it tends to tip. It is not tending to right itself, but it's capsizing. So in other words, the conventional ways to think about this do not give you the type of outcomes that you're looking for. Okay, so I think my view, and I just parallel something George Soros has been on for a long time, we really need a paradigm shift in economic thinking and economic policy. Paradigm shift comes from Thomas Kuhn, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. A paradigm in Kuhn's sense is just a theoretical framework in which we interpret events. So we had the geocentric framework of the universe, and that was overturned, and then we had Newtonian classical mechanics, that's overturned. So if you look, the old paradigm is classical economics, which operates under an interesting hydraulic metaphor. When people think about the economy, they talk about flows of funds, like fluids flowing through a system, or pressure, or overheating, things that suggest this big clanking hydraulic machine. And of course, the modern view of efficient markets, which leads to what, in my view, are like very bad policy calls, such as marking banks' assets to markets. Okay, so a new paradigm, I think, would focus on markets as complex adaptive systems. These are systems that operate with individual agents, like you and me, making local decisions, and that works its way up into a system. And you cannot infer the behavior of the system from the behavior of individuals. The behavior is all emergent. And the way you have to model this is with agent-based models as opposed to equilibrium models, other sorts of models like that. Okay, this is just to set it up as a paradigm with physics. We had classical mechanics, then Einstein and relativity overturned that. Quantum mechanics then created more problems for that. Classical economics, Keynes invented macroeconomics. Minsky took Keynes one step further with the financial instability hypothesis. And then lately, and this is going back almost 20 years, the economy is an evolving complex system. This edition that you see on the right of the page is edited by Phil Anderson, who won the Nobel Prize in Physics, Ken Arrow, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics, and David Pines, another distinguished physicist. So this is a book by Eric Beinhocker of McKinsey, who wrote this a few years ago, and I think it's a really good introduction to kind of a new paradigm in economic thinking. But I appended this quote from the great playwright Tom Stoppard. He said, "A door like this is cracked open 5 or 6 times since we got up on our hind legs. It's the best possible time to be alive when almost everything you thought you knew is wrong." Not meaning to pick on anybody, but here's something that I think was wrong. The idea that austerity measures could trigger stagnation is incorrect. Okay, so here's a conversation that Jamie Dimon from J.P. Morgan had with Chairman Bernanke. He said, "Has anyone bothered to study the cumulative effect of all these things? Do you have a fear, like I do, that when we look at back, they, meaning the regulations, will be a reason that it took so long that our banks, our credit, our businesses, and most importantly, job creation started again?" Bernanke said, "I can't pretend anybody really has. We don't really have the quantitative tools to do that." That's sort of an interesting statement. But we're developing the quantitative tools. The Office of Financial Research in the United States, this is a picture of Andy Lowe, who co-authored this paper called A Survey of Systemic Risk Analytics. What they're trying to do is develop a framework systemically to analyze and think about policy. Okay, here's a really interesting paper I would commend to your review called Ecology for Bankers. It's written by, the Fed actually had these people sit down. It's Bob May, Sir Robert May at the top, Simon Levin of Princeton in the middle, and George Sugihara, who's an ecologist. And the caption here is, "There is common ground in analyzing financial systems and ecosystems, especially in the need to identify conditions that dispose a system to be knocked from seeming stability into another less happy state." One of the interesting things that came out of this paper was the idea that one of the things that can propel shocks through a system is common regulatory framework. So, for example, saying that banks under Basel II could hold sovereign debt without capital because it was risk-free. So the banks load up on that. It turns out not to be risk-free, and the problem of it not being risk-free is quickly transmitted through all of the banks at once. A much better system would be a system where there were local regulations instead of global regulations. It creates a diverse system which is more robust. Okay, I think the best theoretical work done by John Giannakopoulos at Yale. And he's been working on the leverage cycle. And what he's done with the work on the leverage cycle is to essentially formalize the work of Minsky and take it to a different mathematical level. And one of the things that John pointed out when in his papers and talks on this is the following. He said, this was actually known a long time ago. The Merchant of Venice, Shakespeare 400 years ago got this right in the Merchant of Venice. And he says, from a policy standpoint, the central bankers, the policy makers, the monetary authority, they think that the interest rate is the key rate. That's how you influence the economy. He says, he said, in the Merchant of Venice, did anybody know what the interest rate was that Shylock charged? No, nobody knows. Everybody knows what the collateral was, though. The collateral was a pound of flesh. John's comment is that in a modern economy, it's not just the interest rate, it's the collateral value or the leverage in the system which is critically important. Because under the Minsky framework, assets inflate, leverage inflates, and John has been able to formalize that and said, so what really central bankers need to do and policymakers need to do is manage some combination of the interest rate and the leverage in the system and the collateral value. So part of what's going on right now is obviously an attempt to manage the leverage in the system, trying to bring the leverage down through austerity. Unfortunately, that's being self-defeating. Leverage is going up through austerity. But the other key part is to try and manage the asset values, and I think that's where people have had a much greater success, as you'll see in just a second. Okay, but going back to this point at the initial part about why countries have differential success rates, this is a new book by Darren Asimoglu and Jim Robinson called Why Nations Fail. Countries differ in their economic success because of their different institutions, the rules influencing how the economy works, and the incentives that motivate people. So the suggestion here being, if you're going to try and transmit through policy, you're going to have to deal with these individual instruments on a localized basis. The problems in Spain and Ireland are very different from the problems in Greece, for example, or in Italy, and policies to try and put that on the same level are unlikely to be terribly successful. So the problem for policymakers in an interconnected world is, Paul talked about the paradox of thrift. It's a specific instance of the fallacy of composition, which in turn is evidence for what I think is a much more important thing called the ergodic fallacy. And without getting into this, I think it's a very important thing, though, is that the economy is not an ergodic system. An ergodic system is one where no matter what happens, no matter where you start, or no matter what way you get to it, you always end up in equilibrium. So here's an example. If I take 1,000 people and they flip one coin, roughly 500 heads and 500 tails will come up. If I take one person and they flip 1,000 coins, roughly 500 heads and 500 tails will come up. That's an ergodic system. If I take one woman and get her pregnant, she'll have a baby in 9 months. But 9 women will not have a baby in 1 month. That's a non-ergodic system. And so the economy is a non-ergodic system, just like you can have these policies that single people or people at the micro level can save too much, but it doesn't mean that that is good for the whole economy. It's a non-ergodic system. Very, very important because almost all of economic theory is based on the economy being an ergodic system. In fact, Paul Samuelson said, if the economy is not ergodic, then economics isn't a science. I'll just leave that staying right there. Okay, I'm going to skip. This is the Sergeant Wallace paper, so Paul saved me about 2 minutes, so I'm not going to talk about that. This is something that gets into pragmatic policy. This is a statement from the FDIC in 1944. The question is not whether a bank has enough capital for the type of assets which it now holds and the risks which it now appears to face, but whether it has enough capital to enable it to assume the proper and reasonable risks of participating in the financing of business enterprise. So a very different approach to how banks ought to be thought about from a regulatory standpoint, very different from what's happening right now in terms of trying to straitjacket banks into certain levels of capital, which, it doesn't really matter if it's 8%, 10%, 12%, 15%. If you go back 100 years, almost every bank had capital at 10 or 15 or 20% of equity. It did not prevent banking panics. It did not prevent financial collapses. Okay, so part of what's going on here, since we're in France, I'll quote Proust. The facts of life do not penetrate to the sphere in which our beliefs are cherished. They did not engender those beliefs, and they are powerless to destroy them. They can inflict on them continual blows of contradiction and disproof without weakening them. So, and I think you tend to see that many people's beliefs are quite impervious to evidence or to empirical observation. William James put it more positively. He said, to perceive the world differently, we must be willing to change our belief system. Let the past slip away, expand our sense of now, and dissolve the fear in our minds. New facts burst old rules, then newly defined conceptions bind old and new together into a reconciling law. I thought with Paul's paper, that was part of what he's trying to do, I think, with that paper. Okay, so the way ahead. This is just a very impressionistic view from an equity guy. What I think needs to happen going forward from a policy standpoint is we need tighter fiscal integration, ultimately through a common treasury, bank stabilization or recapitalization, ideally through forbearance and not through forced recapitalization. Structural reforms must continue. That's very long term. Programs to promote sustainable debt levels. I think that's a question of how you're trying to get there. And then ultimately balancing the imbalances, because Germany has a competitive advantage over everybody else in terms of unit labor cost, and that's got to be dealt with one way or another. What the ECB needs to do, lower the target rate to zero. Ultimately, I think that's what's going to happen. There's interesting discussion this morning on which is the right rate, the deposit rate, the bank rate. But I think ultimately that the target rate's important because it's a signaling mechanism, it's an information mechanism. Depreciating the euro, I think, is critical. The euro, in my view, should be about parity, and then liquidity, which is now being provided. Okay, so this is all about a market-based approach. What we see from Greenspan to Bernanke to Mr. Draghi is, I think, an interesting thing. So Bernanke said at one point a couple years ago, stock rallies might be the best economic stimulus. He also said, I think we underestimate the impact of equity values on the level of economic activity. Then Mr. Bernanke, a couple years ago, higher stock prices will boost consumer wealth and confidence, which can spur spending. And then much more recently, the Wall Street Journal asked Mr. Draghi, what's the first statistic you look at in the morning? He said stock markets. And obviously, because there's a couple things going on here that I don't have time to get into, which is one of them is Fisher's view was in order to get out of these debt deflation traps, you have to reflate the price level back to what it was before and reflate the asset values back. So stock prices go up, obviously do a couple things. They raise asset values, and they also de-lever by itself because that's equity. And if you, just to go back to this for 1 second, if you go back to the Depression, what ultimately President Roosevelt did was he threw out the ideas of his economic advisors and who wanted to stay on the gold standard, and he reasoned as follows, which I found this very interesting. He said, you know, if the problem is that jobs are falling, GDP is falling, prices are falling, the stock market is falling, and that's bad. He said, therefore, if I can get jobs growing, the stock market going up, GDP going up, and price going up, that must be good. And he said, so good policy is that which gets to that result, and bad policy is that which keeps that thing going that way. And he took us off the gold standard, and his policy was a fantastic recovery that got derailed later. Okay, so after the Buddhist Noble Eightfold Way, this is the fivefold noble way out, ultimately economic growth, fiscal adjustment, austerity, restructuring, defaulting on the debt, somebody getting that debt down, inflation which works, and financial repression, keeping the short rates, keeping the term structure rates actually below where, which is keeping real rates actually below the growth rate of the economy. We did that from roughly 1945 to 1979 or 80 in the U.S., and it worked great. The mix is the key. The U.S. is undergoing what Ray Dalio, the great hedge fund manager, said is a beautiful deleveraging. We're sort of right now in that position where, you know, our term structure rates peaks at around 3.3, and our growth rate is around 4 or 5, and so that's a great situation for the economy to keep growing. Okay, winding up here, this is the Austrian philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. When we think about the future of the world, we always have in mind its being at the place where it would be if it continued to move as we see it moving now. We do not realize that it moves not in a straight line, and its direction changes constantly. Okay, and then the last slide I have here and the last thought I have here is this from Mark Pagel, a new book called Wired for Culture. The history of humanity is a progressive triumph of cooperation over conflict, driven by simultaneous genetic and cultural evolution. If you look at what's going on right now, I think in Europe with the European situation and with all of the issues, you know, there's multiplicity of views, I think, but there's one view which is that people say, well, this is kind of the death rattle of a failed experiment. And we have a monetary union without a fiscal union. We're seeing now that that cannot possibly work, and that ultimately it will have to collapse because it's structurally unsound. That's certainly one possible outcome. The world is not predetermined. I have a different view of that, actually, which is it's not the death rattle of a failed experiment. It's a very painful birth pangs of a new, more unified Europe. I think a Europe which will ultimately become more prosperous, more stable, and will have greater opportunity. So thank you.
I think we've just had a tour de force, a marvelous history lesson, and a platform for a 1-hour lunch, and we will resume with monetary policy discussion after lunch. Bill Miller, thank you so much. Great to have you introduce us to this history lesson. It was marvelous. Thank you.